Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something pretty fascinating. We're going to peel back the incredibly complex layers of a nation's economy to find its true, undeniable value. When you flip on the news, you hear these massive numbers thrown around, trillions of dollars here, huge growth percentages there. But what's the actual reality behind those numbers? And what's just an illusion created by changing prices? Well, that's exactly what we're going to uncover today.
It all starts with one massive question. Think about it for a second. How do we actually measure the success of an entire country? It's not like you can just put a nation on a scale, right? You've got millions of people, literally billions of transactions happening, factories building airplanes, and teenagers buying hot dogs at the corner stand. How on earth do you take all of that chaotic, nonstop activity and boil it down into a single, reliable metric that tells you if a country is thriving or struggling? Economists actually have a highly specific system for doing exactly that, and we're about to map it out.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First, the nation's income. Second, the circular flow. Third, real versus nominal GDP. Fourth, the hot dog economy. And fifth, the limits of GDP. All right, part one, the nation's income. Let's lay down the ground rules for the economy. To really grasp a nation's income, we need to set up some foundational rules of macroeconomics, straight from N. Gregory Mankew's Principles of Economics. And that brings us to the ultimate objective scale for an economy's weight, gross domestic product, or GDP. Now, I know you've heard the acronym a million times, but let's look at the official definition. GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. Sounds super simple, right? But honestly, every single word in that definition is carrying a ton of weight. So let's unpack exactly what they mean. Okay, here are the strict rules of this GDP scale. First up, market value. This means we use actual market prices to combine vastly different things, like literally comparing apples and oranges, into one single measure of value. Second, we only count final goods. Let me give you a quick story to explain why. Imagine a farmer sells flour to a baker, and then the baker uses that flour to bake a loaf of bread. Well, GDP only counts the price of the bread. Why? Because the value of the flour is already baked into the price of the bread. If we counted both the flour and the bread, we'd be double counting. We definitely don't want that. Third, GDP only includes goods that are currently produced, so no used cars or selling off past inventory. And finally, within a country means it strictly measures production inside geographic borders, regardless of who actually owns the factory.
Moving right along to part two, the circular flow. Let's look at the economic machine.
So it's one thing to have a textbook definition, but it's a whole other thing to see how money physically moves through this giant societal machine. To understand a nation's income, you really have to look at the economy from two perspectives at the exact same time: income versus expenditure. Income is the total amount earned by households. We're talking wages, rent, profit. Expenditure, on the other hand, is the total amount spent by those very same households on goods and services. And here's the brilliant part. For an economy as a whole, income absolutely must equal expenditure. Why? Because every single dollar you spend buying a cup of coffee is literally a dollar of income for the barista and the cafe owner. The money just loops in a perfect circle. Expenditure equals income. Period. Which brings us to part three, real versus nominal GDP. This is the core conflict. Now, what's really interesting about this is where things start to get tricky. If total expenditure goes up, well, it could mean the economy is actually producing more stuff. Or it could just mean the exact same goods are suddenly way more expensive. Nominal GDP measures production valued at current prices, so it can skyrocket purely because of inflation, creating this massive illusion of growth. Real GDP, however, measures production valued at constant base year prices. It essentially freezes the prices in place so we can see the true physical growth. Real GDP is the hard reality. To find that reality, economists use a really specific tool called the GDP deflator. Think of the GDP deflator as our mathematical magnifying glass. It strips away all those price hikes to reveal the true economic value underneath. By comparing nominal GDP to real GDP, the deflator isolates exactly how much of that economic growth was just a mirage caused by rising prices. All right, part four, the hot dog economy. Let's run a microscale test. Okay, enough abstract theory for a minute. Let's shrink the global economy way down to a microscale test environment that produces absolutely nothing but fast food. If we look at this raw data spanning from 2019 to 2021, in our little hot dog economy, you can see that production is definitely increasing. We go from making 100 hot dogs to 200 hot dogs. But look closely at the prices. The price of a hot dog triples from $1 to $3. The price of a hamburger doubles from $2 to $4. Both the physical quantities and the prices are steadily rising at the exact same time. So how much did our economy actually grow? Let's calculate the truth here.
Let's walk through the logical story of these equations step by step. Step 1. We find the nominal GDP for each year. We do this by multiplying that year's current prices by that year's current quantities. Step 2. We find the real GDP. To do this, we lock in our base year prices from 2019. That's $1 for hot dogs, $2 for hamburgers, and we multiply those frozen prices by the current quantities of the later years. Then step 3, we calculate the GDP deflator by dividing the nominal GDP by the real GDP and multiplying by 100. Let's see what happens when we actually run the numbers. And this brilliantly illustrates the exact conflict we've been talking about. Look at the nominal GDP numbers. It totally explodes from $200 in 2019 all the way to $1,200 in 2021. If you only looked at nominal GDP, you'd think the economy grew by 6 times. No way, right? Now look at the much humbler reality of real GDP. When we freeze the prices, we see the actual physical output only grew from $200 to $500. The massive difference between those two numbers is captured perfectly by our GDP deflator, which climbs from 100 all the way up to 240.
Now, because we have that deflator, we can figure out exactly how much inflation distorted our fast food economy in the second year. The formula, derived directly from Mankiw's text, is pretty simple. We take the year 2 deflator, which is 171, and subtract the year 1 deflator, which is 100. Then we divide that by the year 1 deflator and multiply by 100 to get our percentage. The result? 71%. In just one single year, prices inflated by an astonishing 71%. That single number proves just how heavily rising prices can camouflage the true state of an economy. Without stripping away that 71% inflation, we'd be completely blind to the reality of our own production. Which leads us perfectly to part 5, the limits of GDP. Let's talk about what the math misses. So the crucial point is this. While we now have a perfectly calculated, inflation-adjusted number to measure our economy, we have to pivot and ask a slightly more philosophical question. What does this perfect math actually leave out? Well, GDP completely ignores what we might call the invisible economy. It doesn't measure the value of your leisure time or the joy of spending a weekend with your family. It completely ignores the quality of the environment too, like a factory might boost GDP while dumping toxic waste into a river. It also misses any activities that happen outside of official markets. If you pay a chef to cook for you, boom, it adds to GDP. But if you cook the exact same meal for yourself at home, GDP sees absolutely nothing. Unpaid housework, childcare, volunteer work, these critical human factors add immense value to our society, but they register as a big fat zero on the GDP scale. But wait, before we completely dismiss GDP, Mankiw makes a concluding point that we absolutely have to remember. While it's definitely an imperfect measure of societal happiness, a high GDP still profoundly matters. Why? Because a large GDP is exactly what buys the resources that improve our quality of life. It's the engine that generates the funds for better hospitals, superior educational systems, cleaner technologies, and broader social safety nets. Look, GDP doesn't measure the poetry of life, but it certainly measures our ability to afford the books. Let's wrap this up by testing what you've just learned. Straight from our source material, I want you to think about this quiz question. Which of the following does not add to U.S. GDP? Is it A, a company selling a plane overseas, B, a corporation building a new factory, C, a city paying a police officer's salary, or D, the government sending a Social Security check to your grandmother? I want you to think carefully about the rules of current production, final goods, and actual expenditures we covered today. I'll leave you to ponder how the mechanics of this massive economic machine truly operate. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the numbers.